For a few seconds before the ramp goes down, it is almost quiet inside the boat. Just the engine, the slap of water against plywood, and 36 young men trying not to be sick. None of them know it, but the flat-bottom box carrying them toward the most defended beach on Earth was not built for war at all. It was built for fur trappers. In a swamp, 1,000 miles from any ocean. By the end of this, you are going to be in that boat with them, on that beach, in the worst minute of their lives. But first, you need to know how the boat got there, and why the general who commanded the entire invasion would one day say that the man who built it was the man who won the war. He was never a soldier. He never set foot on that beach, and you have almost certainly never heard his name. Before that morning, the Allies faced a problem nobody had solved. To take Europe back from Hitler, they had to land an army from the sea. But every army in history had come ashore at a port, a harbor, with deep water and docks and cranes to lift out the trucks and the guns. The Germans understood this perfectly. They had turned every harbor on the coast of France into a fortress of concrete and steel. In the summer of 1942, the Allies tested the old way at a French port called Dieppe. They went in to seize a harbor head-on. In a few hours, more than half the raiding force was killed, wounded, or captured. The lesson was written in blood, and every commander read it the same way. You could not take a defended harbor by force. So the planners were left with a single, desperate idea. If you cannot land at a harbor, then you have to land where there is nothing at all, on an open, empty beach. There was just one problem. No boat in the United States Navy could do it. Their landing craft needed deep water and a dock to unload. Run one straight up onto a beach and it would turn sideways in the surf, swamp, and stick fast in the sand. The entire invasion of Europe, the whole future of the war, depended on a boat that did not exist. Except that it did exist, and it was sitting in a swamp. Deep in the steaming bayous of Louisiana, a boat builder named Andrew Higgins had spent years quietly solving a much smaller problem. His customers were oilmen, lumber crews, and fur trappers, men who worked the shallow marshes where the water ran only inches deep and hid logs and mud and sandbars that could rip the bottom out of an ordinary boat. They needed something that could run over almost nothing, climb right up onto a muddy bank, and slide back off again without damage. So Higgins built it. A flat bottom, so it drew almost no water. A propeller tucked up inside a protective tunnel where the debris could not reach it. And a curved spoonbill bow that pushed the water down and let the boat ride up onto solid ground, then pull away. He called it the Eureka. It was a strange, brilliant little workboat, and without a single person in Washington realizing it, it was already the answer to the problem that would decide the Second World War. Higgins himself was not the kind of man the Navy was used to. He was a barrel-chested, hot-tempered Irishman with a square jaw and a habit of looking like he was ready for a fight, because most of the time he was. He had been born in Nebraska, of all the landlocked places, and thrown out of school as a boy for fighting. He built his first boat in the family basement when he was 12, and it came out so large they had to knock down a wall to get it into the water. He drank, he swore, and he was perfectly willing to scream in the face of an admiral. He was, in almost every way, exactly the kind of man the Navy's polished Bureau of Engineers did not want to hear from. There is even a story, and Higgins never quite denied it, that during Prohibition, he held a government contract to build fast boats for the Coast Guard to chase down the rum runners smuggling liquor along the Gulf Coast. And then, the story goes, he quietly went to the rum runners and offered to sell them boats that were even faster. True or not, it tells you everything about the man. He did not care where the rules said the answer was supposed to come from. He cared whether his boat was the best one on the water. And for years, the Navy made him pay for that attitude. They insisted on building their own landing boats to their own designs drawn up by their own engineers. The boats were bad. Time after time, in trial after trial, Higgins's flat-bottomed swamp boat beat them. It was faster, it was tougher, and unlike the Navy's, it actually worked. And still the Bureau resisted him, for the simplest and most human of reasons. The idea had not come from inside their own walls. It took the outbreak of a world war and a Marine Corps that had finally run out of patience to force the Navy's hand. But even then, the boat was not finished. In its early form, when it reached the shore, the men had to scramble up and out over the high sides, slow and clumsy and deadly, with an enemy waiting for them. So in 1942, the Marines came to Higgins with one specific demand: put a door in the front, build us a bow that drops so the men can run straight out onto the beach. Higgins took one of his boats, cut the entire front off it, and built in its place a heavy steel ramp, hinged to fall flat in a single second. That one change turned a humble workboat into a weapon of war. The Navy called it the LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. But to every soldier and Marine who ever rowed one toward a hostile shore, it had a simpler name: the Higgins boat. Plywood sides, a flat bottom that could run right up onto the sand, and a steel ramp at the bow. Hold on to that ramp. You are going to meet it again at the worst possible moment, on the worst morning of the century. There was one more thing the boats needed, and it was not a part you could build. Someone had to drive them. A landing boat is useless, worse than useless, if it broaches in the surf or drops its ramp too early in water too deep, spilling men straight to the bottom under the weight of their own gear. So Andrew Higgins built a school. At his own expense, on the lake outside New Orleans, he trained thousands of young coxswains, 30,000 of them by some counts, to take his boats through breaking waves and hold them steady against a hostile shore. His chief instructor was a hard man who shouted at every nervous teenager who came through the program because he understood something they did not yet. Very soon, on a beach none of them could imagine, the lives of an entire boatload of men would depend on whether the kid at the wheel kept his nerve. Remember him too, the man at the wheel. And then Higgins had to build the boats themselves by the thousand, faster than anyone believed possible. What happened next in New Orleans has almost no equal in the history of American industry. His company went from around 50 workers to more than 20,000. He opened plant after plant, 8 of them in the end, running day and night, until the city of New Orleans actually closed the public streets around the factories so that boats could be assembled out in the open road. By 1943, of the roughly 14,000 vessels in the entire United States Navy, more than 9 out of every 10 had been designed by this one man in Louisiana, and in a matter of months, more than 1,000 of them would be pointed at a single stretch of French coast. And here is the part of the story that almost no one ever tells. This was the segregated Deep South of the 1940s, a place built on the idea that black and white could not share the same drinking fountain, let alone the same workbench. Andrew Higgins ignored all of it. He put black workers and white workers, women and men, side by side on the very same assembly lines, and he paid them the same wage for the same job. It was nearly unheard of in that time, in that place. He did not do it as a cause or a statement. He did it because he needed boats, and he would take the best pair of hands he could find and pay them honestly for the work. The people the rest of the country looked straight past are the people who built the boat that was about to carry its sons onto the beaches of France. If this is the kind of story you came here for, the forgotten people standing just behind the moments you already know, then take 1 second and subscribe. It genuinely helps. Because the morning all of those boats were built for has arrived now, and it is time you saw it from the inside. It is 6 o'clock in the morning, the 6th of June, 1944. The coast of Normandy. You are in the boat now. You cannot see the beach. You cannot see much of anything, only the flat gray steel of the ramp a few inches from your face, and the helmet and pack of the man crushed in against you. The boat climbs and drops, taking each swell with a hard, flat slap. Cold spray sheets over the low sides and runs down the back of your neck, and the steel floor under your boots is already ankle deep in seawater and sick. The diesel engine hammers up through the plywood and into your knees, your spine, your teeth. Around you in the half-dark, men are praying out loud. Men are white-knuckling their rifles. Men are being quietly, helplessly sick into their own helmets, and not one person says a word about it. You are carrying close to 80 pounds of soaked equipment. If you go into deep water, it will take you straight down. Up at the stern, a young coxswain, a kid really no older than you are, fights the wheel, holding the flat-bottomed boat dead on its line through the chop. He came up through a school on a lake outside New Orleans. A hard man shouted at him for weeks, on purpose, so that he would not break in this exact moment. He is not breaking. He is taking you in. And then, over the engine and the wind, you hear it. A strange, light, almost gentle rattling, like a sudden burst of hail on a tin roof. For 1 second, your mind cannot place the sound. Then it does, and the floor drops out of your stomach. It is not hail. It is machine gun fire, streams of it, and it is striking the ramp. That steel ramp, the one the Marines demanded and Higgins designed, the one two men argued over across a desk in New Orleans 2 years ago, is the only thing standing between you and the guns. And it is ringing over and over with the rounds meant for your chest. The coxswain holds his nerve. He drives straight in. The engine note climbs higher, and then you feel it through your entire body, the long, flat hull grinding up onto the sand. The boat beaches itself, smoothly, perfectly, the exact same way it once climbed a muddy riverbank for a fur trapper who could never have imagined this. And it stops. For half of 1 second, nobody moves. Then the ramp drops. The world pours in all at once. The light, the sound, the full, deafening wall of it, the surf and the artillery and the shouting and the endless tearing of the guns. The man in front of you takes a single step down the ramp and is instantly gone. There is no time to understand it. You step after him because there is nowhere else on earth to go. The cold water closes over your legs and rips the breath out of your chest. The bottom shelves away beneath your boots, and the 80 pounds on your back hauls you down, and then, somehow, your feet find sand, and you put your head down, and you run. Behind you, already, the empty boat is backing off the beach. The flat bottom slides free of the sand, and the coxswain reverses it cleanly into the surf. The little swamp boat performing its last humble trick, peeling away to cross the channel and bring in 36 more. It will make that run again, and again all day and into the night. A plywood box with a steel door, ferrying frightened young men to the edge of the world one boatload at a time, while the men it has already delivered claw their way up the sand a single yard at a time. Stop for 1 moment and understand what you are looking at. This is the boat. This ugly little flat-bottom box from a Louisiana bayou. The thing Andrew Higgins sketched out for trappers and oil men. The thing the Navy did not want. The thing built by the very people the country refused to see. It is here, on the most important morning of the century, standing between an entire army and the sea. And it is working. It is winning. The United States Navy spent the better part of a decade deciding it did not want this boat. The men on this beach need it more than they need air. More than 1,000 Higgins boats ran the beaches of Normandy that morning. By the time the sun went down, 160,000 men had crossed onto the shores of France. And it did not begin there, and it did not end there. They had already gone ashore in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in Higgins boats. They would go ashore at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, across 100 islands of the Pacific in Higgins boats. By the end of the war, very nearly every American who set foot on a hostile shore anywhere on Earth had ridden that last terrible mile in something a stubborn man first dreamed up in a swamp. Almost 20 years after the guns fell silent, a young historian named Stephen Ambrose sat down across from the man who had commanded the entire invasion, Dwight Eisenhower, by then a former president of the United States. As they talked, Eisenhower asked him a question. Had he ever, by chance, met a man named Andrew Higgins? No, Ambrose admitted. Higgins had died back in 1952. Eisenhower was quiet for a moment. That's too bad, he finally said. He is the man who won the war for us. Ambrose later said his jaw simply dropped. Here was the supreme Allied commander, the man who had carried the invasion of Europe on his shoulders, and when the subject of who won the war came up, he named neither a general, nor an admiral, nor a president. He named a boatbuilder from New Orleans. Across the ocean, they say, even Hitler had taken bitter notice of the same man and called him the new Noah. The man who won the war, in the words of the man who ran it, never wore a uniform. He built boats, and then, almost as suddenly as it had risen, it was over. When the war ended, the orders ended with it. The contracts that had filled 8 roaring plants and spilled boats into the open streets of New Orleans simply evaporated. The vast machine Higgins had built for the emergency had no peacetime left to run in. The plants fell silent. The workforce scattered to the wind. And Andrew Higgins himself died in New Orleans in 1952, only 65 years old. Still a giant in his own city and already, quietly, beginning to fade from the memory of the country he had served. For decades afterward, the boat that had carried the free world ashore had no real monument. Its builder had no household name. The men who had ridden it onto those beaches carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Almost everyone else simply moved on. There is a Higgins boat in a museum in New Orleans today. In the city where it was born, flat bottom, plywood sides, the steel ramp still hanging at the bow. It does not look like much. A box, a door, an engine. But every man who ever ran down that ramp into the surf rode there on an idea one man sketched for swamp trappers, steered by a kid that same man trained on a lake, in a boat, a whole city of overlooked people built with their hands. The beach, we remember. The boat, we forgot. And the man, you can finally say his name. Andrew Higgins. If a story like this is worth keeping alive, stay with us. There is always another one waiting.